when the XP conversation comes up for me now, I don't want to be a jerk, so I don't say, what do you mean by that? But what I do say is like, hey, what are you going to have that, like, what are you going to have that guy doing? Like, what are you doing now that he's going to do? And how's it being, you know, just try to get at, like, are you talking more about running the business side of the church, which is fine if that's what you want, and you're going to maintain the ministry side, or are you talking about like a true number two who puts lead pastor kind of in his bag? You preach, you do vision, you help raise money, you be the face. I'm going to build out everything else. You know, obviously harder to find that guy.
When we both started the church, there was an assumption like you're going to be kind of wheeling and dealing and trying to make happen whatever it is that you can. And you knew that I was going to be doing the same. And that's how it kind of multiplied our efforts.
This is Breaking Barriers, where we help pastors and churches grow so that they can go.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Breaking Barriers podcast. My name is Pastor Bobby. I'm here with Pastor Andrew, and today's episode we actually took right from our private Facebook group. So if you are not in that group, I'd encourage you to go there. I love it because as this group grows, we're now getting to the point where there's probably 3 or 4 discussions every single week in the group, just about all sorts of different things that we're learning from one another. So somebody in the group, I'm not going to say their name because they didn't give me permission to say their name on the podcast, but they said, hey, can I request a podcast on the role of an executive pastor and when to hire one? Love every episode, share regularly with my staff. And then they just give some context of kind of where their church is at. That's very common. I mean, we talk to a lot of church planners and even churches. I think he said that their church is 800, even churches that are a lot larger that didn't start with an executive pastor. And it's one of those things, once you have a bunch of other staff trying to figure out like, man, when is the right time? Maybe some of the other staff doesn't quite understand what that role is. And even the name, right? I mean, we think about lead pastor, executive pastor, some of these names and stuff. It's like, it's not biblical language. It's just, we're trying to conceptually come up with, I think I like to more think of just the idea of like kind of number two. Yeah. To me, that translates a little bit better than executive pastor, because some people hear executive pastor and they think like accounting or finance or whatever else. So I figured what we could do today is kind of try to answer the question, hey, at least in terms of the way that we think about it, like what is an executive pastor? Yeah. Maybe what is some of the general wiring maybe of somebody that could do that role. And I do think people can approach it from different types of gift sets, but there probably is some sort of general makeup of that person. And then maybe get into that discussion a little bit, like, you know, do you wait to do that, or should it be one of the first things that you do? Right. And
just trying to build the need for it, you know, like, I think that, and I've said this forever, I think that a lot of times the difference in churches that really grow and get after it and go is not actually the lead chair. It's the second chair, you know, because you can see guys that have similar talents many times in terms of preaching and even vision and stuff. But if they don't have that integrator to kind of make it into rocket fuel, then it can end up just kind of falling flat, you know? And so I think that a lot of times lead pastors, I feel very blessed, obviously, by you, Bobby. I mean, I feel like that's been a huge part of our story and our success, and God bless that is just the dynamic that we have.
Why don't you set that up just for 60 seconds?
Yeah, I mean, just, you know, when we came to plant, you know, you jumped in to be the number two, and I don't know that we even knew exactly what all that was going to mean. And it's meant a lot of things over the years. Right. But it was, we knew pretty clearly from the beginning that I was going to bear a lot of the load of the preaching ministry, and you were going to bear a lot of the load of the administration. I think our relationship may be a little dynamic compared to others, like, because I feel like we've kind of shared a lot of the vision. But even now, I've been trying to be more of a visionary, and I think you're trying to be more of an integrator, and we're 12 years in, you know, so, but I do think that has been one of the things that has created the growth and the sending in Mercy Hill. And, you know, for lead pastors out there, I was thinking it's a little bit like what they talk about with like quarterbacks in the NFL. You know, a lot of times you'll have very similar talent levels, but if they land with like the wrong offensive coordinator and the wrong, you know, weapons on offense, like you'll just see these guys that could have really succeeded struggle. And I feel like that's a little bit true with lead pastors when it comes to that number two chair. Like if you end up getting paired up with the right guy, I feel like it can end up making you shine as a lead pastor. And if you don't, then it can end up being something that you're really bogged down and constantly getting off of the major things that you need to be doing because you're just constantly bogged down by everything else in the organization. So I just think it's very important. I think it's a huge conversation in terms of church planning, number one, but also just in church health overall.
Yeah, like you referenced a book that I think is helpful. It's a just secular organizational leadership book called Rocket Fuel, and it uses kind of the image of rocket fuel, because when the relationship between somebody in an organization where one person's really focused on visionary parts of the organization and one person's really focused more on the organizational side and making the vision happen, giving feet to the vision, then it could become rocket fuel. I think it really requires kind of the right even spirit from the lead pastor, because I think about, one of the things with you, Andrew, like a lot of lead pastors, maybe the thing that like makes them want to plant a church or be a lead pastor is just because, not in a bad way, but like, man, they're very entrepreneurial. Like they want to kind of do everything, and that's awesome. And you are too, but I think sometimes that can kind of get in the way of them actually wanting to hire an executive pastor, because they have that spirit of like, man, I need to do everything. Mm-hmm. Like I'm starting this thing, I'm launching this thing. And I remember when we started, it actually was, I would say kind of on, this was about 13 and a half years ago. It was kind of on the cusp of this stuff was changing. Because I remember a couple of years before that, let's say 15 years ago, it wasn't very common for a church to plant with two pastors kind of starting out. Right. One being lead pastor and one being executive pastor. I feel like we kind of were on the front end of sensing, man, that it's something like this needs to happen. Yeah. Now, at least in our stream, it's like, it's kind of seen as like the essential thing if you want to be successful. Yeah. But it requires the number one guy to see the importance of it kind of working that way.
Right.
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, the Acts 29 model was, man, you are the only elder too, for a long time. And I think we bucked the mold on that big time. I mean, I remember I had to go get like a provisional, we're not Acts 29, but from the church we were coming out of, the summit, I kind of had to convince them I didn't want to go alone as an elder alone.
Right.
And so, I mean, we, and so we went with two elders. We went with two, I went with, as a lead pastor, you're the executive pastor. So, I mean, I feel like we kind of, and we shared a lot at the beginning too. There's probably horror stories from guys who've done that and they don't, it doesn't work out if they're not really like locked into the role and excited about the role. So maybe, you got to be careful about that. But in general, man, I think this is, I think the rocket fuel analogy is the right analogy.
Yeah. So two things that are helpful for me, I think, in trying to explain this, or maybe like that word executive can kind of throw people off, but like, okay, what is it you're trying to do when you're trying to hire a number two, or you're trying to hire somebody in that type of role in your church? Two analogies I think are good. So, the military, they talk about things as being like force multipliers. I've heard this language a lot. This could be a person. This could be like a unit in the military. A lot of times it's like that you think of a technology, right? So like you think of a force multiplier, like I don't know when it was invented, but let's just say 25 years ago when the U.S. military started using night vision. You take another force that doesn't have night vision and you put them against a force that has night vision and they're fighting at night, you could put 10 guys against 100 guys, right? Because the night vision can make 10 guys fight like 100 guys. Right. And that's the idea of a force multiplier. That could be a strategy, that could be a structure, that could be technology. I think that's kind of the idea of an executive pastor. The goal would be, hey, as a lead pastor, I want to hire somebody that's going to kind of exponentially multiply the vision, the impact. It's going to really put feet to the vision. I also think of the idea of leverage. You're definitely a redneck, so I'm sure you have stories of like the importance of using leverage. But the idea of leverage is, and this goes back to Exodus 18 with Moses and his father-in-law Jethro. Right. The idea of leverage is, some guys, and we try to speak against this, that they want to be a lead pastor. Like, I only want to relate to people one-on-one. I don't want my church to grow beyond 100 people because then I can't impact people one-on-one. And I'm like, man, it's very biblical to want your church to grow. And then when it does grow, you have to figure out how can I use leverage. Right. And what leverage means is raising up leaders, preaching, casting vision. These are things where you can impact 10 people at a time or 20 people at a time or 100 people at a time. That's the idea of using leverage. I don't know if you had any good redneck stories of.
I have a lot of redneck stories, but I think probably people know what leverage is. Maybe so. I don't know if we have to illustrate leverage, but to your point, I do think the executive pastor is exactly that. Because one of the things I was going to say on this podcast, and I'll go ahead and say it now because I think it fits, is a lead pastor's role doesn't change a whole lot, whether there are 100 people at your church or 1,000. Mm-hmm. Man, you're going to preach, you're going to try to raise money, you're going to lead vision, And so how is it that you end up, affecting change in bigger and bigger groups of people when your job hasn't really changed a whole lot, if that makes sense? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like you would think the lead pastor's job at 1,000 would just be like entirely different than at 100. It's like, well, it's not really. And I think the very fact that it's not really that different shows you that it has to come, like the change that you're seeking to affect has to come through leverage. Mm-hmm. You are doing the same thing. It's having a bigger impact. Mm-hmm. And I think that's how the executive pastor is used, mm-hmm. That's how they come into play.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's great. So let's talk a little bit about like what is a number two and the way that we think about it. So I would say, there's some different frameworks out there. To me, the one that is very helpful is this idea of visionary integrator. It's basically the idea of a number one and a number two in an organization. It comes from a business book, but I think it's helpful. In that book, they talk about the visionary, and that's the role that you are in. They cast vision. They preach, they try to inspire people, they try to dream big. They're thinking further in the future for the organization, so they're not just wrapped up in the day-to-day, they're not just wrapped up in the week-to-week. That's hard to do sometimes, but they're further in the future. Sometimes, maybe it's kind of typical for a person, this is not how you are, but it's kind of typical maybe for a person in this role where maybe they struggle with the details, or they struggle with the systems, or they struggle with the execution. To me, it kind of doesn't even matter about natural wiring. I mean, I think you need a natural inclination if you're going to be the visionary or the integrator or whatever. Like, nobody can do all of these roles really well in the same person.
Yeah.
Because like at some point, just the visionary stuff with the preaching and casting vision and thinking about the future, I mean, that just needs to take up the majority of your brain space.
Right.
And somebody else needs to be doing the other stuff. I mean, anything you want to say about just kind of the visionary role?
Well, I think the point you're making is really good because I don't know that I would just say, hey man, I wake up in the world as like a natural visionary. Mm-hmm. But what we've landed on is that is a necessary role in the organization. And that's something I need to grow in and get better at. And somebody needs to be, if there's not somebody thinking about it, there's not anybody thinking about it. We could all be kind of halfway thinking about it, but it needs to be something where that is somebody's job. And yeah, I think it's good. I think in most churches, the lead pastor is going to be the lead visionary. I think there are probably some models where guys try to get real crazy with like a plurality of elder board where the teaching pastor is not that and somebody else is doing that. And I think we've known some situations that has gone sideways even, but I think it's very natural for the lead pastor to be that visionary because man, they're the mouthpiece. A lot of times it's kind of like what those guys 1122 say. Sometimes when you're the one that's speaking it out loud in groups of people all the time, it kind of needed to have come from your guts. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's good to have that lead pastor seat, be the visionary seat.
So thinking about the executive pastor or the integrator role, it's really just this idea that like, hey, they're trying to take the vision and make it a reality, because a lot of times the vision is, hey, guys, could you imagine, a year from now, if God were to bless what we're doing, what we could see happen with church planning or what we could see happen with the growth of the church, or man, could you imagine we hit 500 baptisms or whatever? That's vision. That's like, man, this is what the future could look like if we accomplish our mission. Well, there's a million things behind that, systems and structures and hires. And man, we have a huge problem that's standing in the way between us and our future vision. Like the executive pastor's role is to try to figure out like, okay, like what do we got to do to make this a reality? What's standing in our way? Is it money? Are there problems? And That's really, I mean, that's really the role. And like you said, it does change based on the size of the organization, but conceptually it's still kind of the same, you know? Like at the beginning when the church is smaller, the vision is not as like far cast, you know? So the vision is 6 months away, the vision's a year away. So what the executive pastor's thinking about is also, I think, closer in terms of time frame. But it's still the same stuff in many ways, but it's just, it's I guess, kind of smaller. Like, man, our primary thing right now is that we're meeting in this rented facility and our kid space doesn't feel safe. That's the thing that's getting us in the way of the future vision of growing to be where we want to be. And so it would be the executive pastor's role to like figure that out.
Yeah.
Is it volunteers? Is it staff? Is it money? How do we do that?
Yeah, you're doing the same thing. I think the executive pastor, though, does end up having to work and do those things in different ways. Maybe the disparity between how they worked in the beginning and how they work as they grow is greater than that of the lead pastor. What I mean by that is, like, I mean, 50% of my week is on preaching a sermon on the weekend, and almost nothing about that process has changed at all in 12 years. You know, I do the same thing every time, every week. Whereas what you're saying is like, man, the higher level idea for the executive pastor is, man, we got to solve that problem to let the thing go. But I mean, you would solve those problems personally,
right?
You know, and now it's like, well, if I can hire the right person, I can solve that problem, or you know what I mean?
Right.
So you're right. You are thinking about the same stuff,
right?
Finances, you know, how to solve problems, that kind of stuff. But I do think you end up working in a way different way. You know, as the church grows, and it really all comes down to I mean, it's in a lot of ways it's administration. I mean, that's a gift from 1 Corinthians 12. You know, you have apostles, prophets, teachers, miracle workers, but then you have helpers and administrators. And I think in some ways this executive pastor role is gifted in that helping and administration, leadership, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So we could talk maybe a little bit about wiring. I think this is probably, you know, the top 3 questions I get from pastors and even churches that are, I mean, you know, we got some larger churches that we're connected with that are struggling to hire an executive pastor, or, you know, a lot of time it's maybe like, man, they had an executive pastor, something changed with the church, maybe they weren't the right person, and, you know, now they've grown larger, and now they're trying to think about like, hey, you know, people will come to me and be like, I want somebody wired the way that you're wired, or how do you think somebody should be wired? I could just kind of share what I feel like has made me as effective as I have been. I'm not saying I'm great in the role. I mean, certainly there's much more talented executive pastors out there, but I could just say what I feel like has helped me in the role to be in this role, you know, from the time the church was 100 people to 4,000 people and all the changes in between, and to not take any break from the role. So I've been there, you know, the whole kind of evolution of what's happened in our church. You know, maybe I'm sure you've had a lot of discussions that I wasn't in the room where somebody was asking you, man, we're trying to hire somebody. For myself, the things that I think have helped is there's a lot of like what Andrew was describing where you're having to jump in and you're having to figure things out. And sometimes you're having to do a role that you know that you don't want to do long term, but it's kind of the only way to make the thing happen. I would say for me, probably the number one thing that I have leaned on is just, I don't know what you would call it, raw decision-making abilities. Just an ability to kind of make decisions when you always don't have all the information. Because a lot of times if you're in a church that's growing and, you know, you're deciding, man, I need to make this hire, or I need to do this thing, or we got to raise up this volunteer thing, you're kind of always doing that on the front end of something. So you don't like have all the information yet. And so you're trying to make a decision where things are kind of gray. You got to kind of feel your way through what the right decision is. I feel like I've had to just make lots of those decisions. I'm wired that way. I realized I was wired that way when I got thrown into this role. There would be things that I would hear other executive pastors, they quit, like they literally quit because they didn't like. And I was like, man, those are the things that I feel like, in terms of just kind of some of the gray area, discernment, decision-making, I was always just kind of wired for that stuff. I'm just going to list 3 real quick. The second is trying to have a feel for what decisions are important decisions to make. Because I see sometimes with guys that are in this role, this can end up killing them. Like if they don't have any sort of filter to try to figure out, like, okay, the church is growing. We went from 200, we're now at 500. If I were to try to make a list of all the problems, you know, there's like 50 problems, and I'm having trouble to kind of decipher between this is a big problem and this is not a big problem. Because there's a difference between, man, some problems feel big, and that's just because they have feelings associated with them. That doesn't necessarily mean they are big.
Right.
Some problems actually are a real big problem, and they have no feelings associated with them. Like, you feel nothing about them, but like, man, if you can't meet budget 4 months from now, it's like, that's a really, really big problem.
Right.
And so maybe somebody that can kind of, you know, prioritize, you know, I think in some sense that is what strategic leadership is, to try to prioritize decision-making and deciding, man, this is the most important lever to pull. The third one that I would say is an ability to understand people. I would not describe myself as like a super people person, but I do feel like I have a good understanding of people and how people are wired, what makes people tick, the different skill sets people have, different things that motivate people. You know, a staff our size, like, man, we have lots of different personalities, lots of different wiring, different volunteers in our church. I just think that's important because the executive pastor, I think, will come into contact with lots of people, because a lot of times once the lead pastor kind of like tells them, hey, run with it, go do this, like, they're the ones having to communicate with people and say, hey, we want to do this, we want to do this. They come in contact probably at the beginning with the most amount of volunteers, the most amount of vendors with the church. So like, they got to be able to like, man, is this a good vendor? Is this not a good vendor? We have some horror stories over the years. And in terms of the staff too, like just an ability to kind of understand personalities, to read people.
Yeah, I mean, I remember one time, look out my window and our parking lot needed a big patch job done on it. And I see this dude in Hungry Howie. He had a Hungry Howie's delivery Honda Civic. You remember this?
Yeah.
He had the Hungry Howie's pizza logo on the top of his Civic. He was delivering pizzas in the back seat.
Patching parking lot.
And then he pops his trunk and he starts pouring out the stuff to patch the parking lot. So we've got, yeah, man, you did a great job with our vendors, dude.
I appreciate that.
No, that was a funny story. Man, I think, I think those things are all awesome. I think those things are essential abilities. I think a couple more things that I would say that I feel like just from our story, and I know it's a little different. Everybody's going to be wired differently and stuff, but I think for me, I know you try really hard to kind of keep me in my lane, meaning like you're not trying to pull me out of that into stuff you're doing. And I could see that maybe some executive pastors that don't have the confidence, or if they have a lead pastor that is constantly barraging them to try to like get down into the weeds. And I think you guys do a good job of like, man, if there's something I want to know, it's like, well, tell me, you know, I'm not going to like, It's not like you're shielding me or something, but generally it's like,
you're saying somebody's maybe a little scared to make the decisions.
Yeah, they don't want to hold it, man. They don't want to hold the weight of the consequences of it, and so they're constantly trying to get the lead pastor to sign off on it, and that is just taking them out of their lane, you know. And I feel like you guys try to do a good job of only really bringing me into stuff that I really need to be in order that I can kind of stay in my lane and just say, man, keep preaching, man, keep casting the vision. We're gonna work it out. We're gonna do it. So I think that's really good. And also I think that stereotypically, I wonder if this role is not created for someone who has a lot of futuristic thinking. I just wonder if like the stereotype would be the visionary is always the futuristic guy and the executive pastor is always kind of the context details guy. Our story's a little funny because we're exactly flipped on that. I'm a context number one and you're a futuristic number one. And I think I'm like a futuristic 30-something, and you're like a context 30-something. So it is funny to me that that's kind of flipped for us. So I don't know if that's maybe just unique to us. But I would say even if somebody doesn't have that as a real strength, I think fighting, you know, in that role to be able to see what the future could look like is important, you know, so that we're not always trying to create systems that are antiquated by the time that they roll out.
Right. Yeah, and I think the larger the church gets, the timelines in terms of what the executive pastor is thinking about, those timelines get a lot longer.
Yeah.
You know? And the funny thing is, you know, being around some churches that are a lot larger than us, I do think a lot of unique sort of personalities end up sitting in that role. You know, you think about Ryan at the Church of 1122.
Yeah.
Like you get around him and it's like, man, he's not like what you would think of like your administrative type of pastor.
Yeah.
You know, because I think some of the problems that have to be solved at that level they're bigger, they're more creative and unique, and the types of things they're thinking about are different. Yeah, because I do see sometimes that because I think the natural tendency is for a church to grow, and they probably should have hired somebody, but they didn't. And they grow to a certain size, and then they're like, man, I need to find like a 59-year-old dude that's about to retire in my church that's like an accountant, you know, and I'm going to hire him and he's going to be the number 2. And there's some parts of that I think would work, you know, like, man, they have organizational experience, they got business experience, but there's some, you know, there is some more creative stuff in terms of what this role needs to be about, creative problem solving that maybe somebody with that kind of wiring, you know.
Yeah. And there's nuance in the nonprofit world. I think that, we've seen it's not always the easiest thing for guys to switch from for-profit to nonprofit. You know, like I think that the conventional wisdom would be, well, the business world is so much harder than the church world. It's so much more complex. There's so much more expertise there that if you could convince a guy to step out of running a small business and into the church, he's going to just be able to do that seamlessly. And there's not, you know, he's going to be better than what the seminaries can produce. And certainly that could be true, you know, but it's definitely not de facto true.
Right.
Because church is not, you know, we tell people we need people to be church smart. I mean, there's a lot that goes into like church and nonprofit world that is not a reality in the business world, you know. The first thing, well, maybe the number one thing is you're dealing with an organization that is by all accounts 90, 95, 98% all volunteers.
Right, so different motivations.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like, hey, man, this guy ran a business of 300 people. I was like, oh, well, he had their paychecks, every single one of them.
Right.
Now you're running, 300 volunteers who are doing this because they're motivated by the gospel, the preaching, the vision, it's just that's a way different ball game, you know. So I don't think it's just as simple as like this guy was a business guy on the outside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So thinking about like maybe kind of moving to the second question, like when should you hire an executive pastor? Like you probably get this question a lot, I would imagine. And I know I do. Like, hey, what should I look for in a hire? Right? I'm trying to hire an executive pastor. People are always saying that. And then, man, like when should it happen? Mm-hmm. So I don't know, like what kind of questions do you feel like you get from guys around that, like thinking about this topic?
I think it feels to me like in our stream, most guys know they want one.
It's kind of assumed now at this point.
I think a lot of times people don't know how they're going to use that role. Mm-hmm. So it feels a little bit like a magic bullet. If I could just have the executive pastor, everything would be better. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes that's pie in the sky, you know. You got to have the right guy. You got to figure out how y'all are going to work together. How much are you going to give him? I mean, our dynamic is like, man, it goes me and then you and then everybody else in the whole organization. Mm-hmm. You know, but that's probably not how everybody's going to start. Mm-hmm. You know, you hire a guy that's more on the operations side. What we would consider a director of operations might be really what they're looking for in an XP. Mm-hmm. So to me, you know, I don't see a lot of guys that are scared to have one. I feel like everybody wants one and everybody thinks it's going to make everything better. You know, but I think you got to answer some of those critical questions about how is this position in the church going to be used? Mm-hmm. We've tried to use it more in the sense of like, man, this is a true number 2. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I think people just use it more like, man, this is a finance guy or an ops guy. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know? So I think you got to get clarity on that first.
Right. Yeah. And I think, you know, I mean, some people, even after everything you just said, would still be like, yeah, I don't really know. Like, I don't really.
Well, you don't go hire somebody then.
You know, people will be like, I hear people saying, man, this is a great thing in the church, and I meet churches that are larger that have an executive pastor, and so it seems like.
Well, when the XP conversation comes up for me now, I don't want to be a jerk, so I don't say, what do you mean by that? Mm-hmm. But what I do say is like, hey, what are you going to have that, like, what are you going to have that guy doing? Like, what are you doing now that he's going to do, and how's it being, you know, just try to get at, like, are you talking more about running the business side of the church, which is fine if that's what you want, and you're going to maintain the ministry side, or are you talking about like a true number 2 who puts lead pastor kind of in his bag? Mm-hmm. Hey, you preach, you do vision, You help raise money, man. You be the face. We're gonna kind of. I'm gonna build out everything else. Obviously harder to find that guy that can do that. But you got to figure out which one you're going for. You can't just generically throw it out, and then you got to hire specifically for that.
Right. Yeah, I think about for us, like when we both started the church, there was an assumption, like, man, like you're going to be kind of wheeling and dealing and trying to make happen whatever it is that you can. And you knew that I was going to be doing the same. And that's how it kind of multiplied our efforts. Mm-hmm. The problem now, I think when somebody's like, man, do I hire an executive pastor? They're like, man, I'm not sure that I don't really know if I want somebody to be wheeling and dealing and going and trying to make things happen. And they're a little bit like, man, do I hire them and kind of put a leash on what they're doing? Mm-hmm. Or they do want somebody to do that, but then you ask them, hey, like, man, what's the crystal clear 1-year vision and 3-year vision, and what exactly are you doing, and what do you want them to go after? And they're like, I don't know. I think they were supposed to be thinking about and figuring out that stuff, So you do have to figure out a lot of stuff to make it work well.
Yeah, and I think we've even had struggles around that.
Yeah,
where we've tried to figure out who's in what seat. Obviously I'm preaching the majority, so that de facto has everybody looking at me like I'm in that total lead chair. But I think there was a time where we were trying to share the vision so much that it was muddy rather than clear. And even it's almost like we've kind of landed on, like, even if you and I could like duke it out over months and come out with a 10% better vision, I think it might be better for us to stay in a lane of like, hey, the biggest stuff, the highest level stuff, I'm going to try to be dreaming about, and that way you can run after it. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, that doesn't mean you don't have vision. I mean, you're always speaking into stuff too, but I do think that I feel like we've gotten synergy by kind of getting clarity on those roles. So you may want to really think about that on the beginning.
Right.
I mean, like even what you just said, that would be a big red flag to me. Like if you're like, what's the executive pastor going to do? And it's like, well, I'm not really sure. And then you said, well, do you have some vision, 1 year, 3 year? And if you're like, well, that's what he was going to do. It's like, well, what are you going to do? You know what I mean? So I think you got to figure out, man, who's going to be holding what, or you can really frustrate each other.
Yeah.
Man, I thought you were going to be doing that. Well, I thought you were going to be doing that,
Right. Yeah, totally. So when should a church hire an executive pastor? I would say general advice, if you were somewhat thinking about it the right way, I would say as soon as you can. Because, like if I tomorrow was just thrown into a position, small church, you're the lead pastor, what hire are you going to make? I'd be trying to hire an executive pastor, because I was like, man, because then they could worry about all this stuff over here, and they could run after what our next hire, man, we need a worship person, we need a kids person, we need the kids ministry to be more safe. But yeah, I don't know. Like what would your advice be? Like a lot of times when people are asking this question, like the church is already going, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe they had an executive pastor and then that one didn't work, and now the church has grown and they're just trying to figure out, like, man, I'm not really sure how to navigate to this next step.
I think that a lot of times, and I, even with an executive pastor, I fell into this for a long time. A lot of times lead pastors view themselves as a CEO during the week and they moonlight as a preacher on the weekend. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's just kind of a recipe for like getting run down, and burning out and all that kind of stuff. If you're not viewing the preaching event as like a major part of your job. I think that, for me, the idea of an executive pastor or associate pastor, I mean, having more hands on deck is inherent to, are you going to is a lead guy going to preach 40 something times a year? And that means that half of his week is going to go to that. And so it's not akin to a small business where you have one guy that's an owner operator, because he don't, half of his whole week is not gone, spent on this one artistic, document and performance, if you want to put it like that. I'm using those terms just to kind of get it to pop. But he's got to go do something that is outside of working in the business and on the business. Mm-hmm. He's got this whole other thing he's got to gets to do. And so to me, I agree with you. Like, that's why we try to launch guys in the beginning with a number two. And I think it's been pretty successful. I think we've seen, if you get that wrong, it can really hurt in the beginning. And if you get it right, it can really help,
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think I just wrote down like some things you may feel, needing this position if you're already kind of going. The lead pastor can feel overwhelmed. Now, you can feel overwhelmed even with an executive pastor, but I do remember at the very beginning, like, man, we would share a lot of things. There was stress, there was tough meetings, there was tough decisions to make. Having somebody else there to help with that and to just shoulder the kind of emotional weight can help. Guys, I think that I see struggle with this a lot. Some of them are awesome visionaries, but the church just doesn't have the execution that it needs. Mm-hmm. Like day to day, what matters is, man, is the church repeating week by week the things that are the most important? Or is it like, man, we get it right around Easter, but we don't get it right the rest of the year. We have a great vision, but we don't have great execution. To me, it's like, man, that'd be a big reason to try to hire somebody. Growth can outpace structure, where it's like, man, we've been around churches like this, and we've been this ourselves, where it's like, man, the church is X size, but when you get around the structures of the church, it's like, man, the church feels actually much smaller.
Right.
Not in a good way, like in a bad way.
Right.
Like, hey, we expected that at your size, you would have had this solved. Mm-hmm. And because the systems are really lagging behind everything else. And then lastly, like, the church can just get stuck, and I would say even as churches grow, because we have some churches that listen that are, they're larger churches, over 1,000 people. You kind of have to go through this kind of multiple phases. I mean, because even now at Mercy Hill, we have people that there's 4 people that report to me that are kind of technically in executive types of roles. And what I define by executive is like they're not directing anything.
Right.
They're over people that are directing people. Mm-hmm. So it's like, man, even at larger levels, you got to figure, okay, what is the next way to multiply this thing? What is the next way to scale this thing? And that's just where a lot of churches get stuck, Mm-hmm. They just come up to 500 or 800 and they just get totally stuck because they can't scale to the next kind of level. I mean, anything that guys share with you that you would say are just kind of signs of like,
I think that, you wrote down lead pastor feels overwhelmed, and that can be totally true. And, you wrote sermons begin to suffer because of all the other stuff. My experience is it seems like all the other stuff begins to suffer because the sermons are going to be number one. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of guys they do understand that is kind of the thing that makes it go. They're not going to sacrifice that, but then because they don't have, somebody else to help shoulder the burden of the other things that are going on, there's group issues, building issues, real estate, where are we moving next? Certainly things with the staff, mm-hmm. Hiring, firing. Those things can end up just being, really suffering. And I think nonprofits are notorious for being high on passion, bad on execution.
Yeah.
And I think an executive pastor, hopefully their hire is a real good shot at remedying that, where the church becomes something where the systems and the execution of things rivals the secular world.
Yeah.
But that feels like it really is all wrapped up in how good the XP is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, my kind of final answer would be like, if you could start and you have the right structure and you could start with it, it's going to be easier than trying to bring somebody in much later. Most of the churches that I know that are larger than us, there's a really great relationship between the number 1 and the number 2. And I'd say it's a bit of a hallmark of, the fact that the churches are where they are. Because like you said, man, there's some amazing vision casters and there's some amazing teachers where the church has struggled to grow mm-hmm. because there's not a person in that number 2 role. So, yeah, I mean, thanks for the question on Facebook. I'd say we just kind of wrap it up here. There's probably lots of other avenues that we could go down talking about this in the future. I would encourage you guys, if you haven't, to join our private Facebook group. We love kind of answering questions like this and really just hearing your feedback, the stuff that you're thinking about. The whole goal with Breaking Barriers is to put stuff out there that's very practical, that's going to help your churches grow. So appreciate you guys.
Thanks.